Hi everyone, welcome to this final video lecture for digital hermeneutics. In the past weeks, we have seen how different people throughout the ages have tried to formulate and formalize a science of interpretation. We looked at close reading, at meticulous categorizations of knowledge. We looked at the deep interrelations between the self and the world when interpreting. And this week, we are going to hold the process of interpretation itself against the light. And we're going to ask, what are we gaining with this focus on depth that we've seen throughout the past weeks? What is so wrong with the surface of language and of experience? In other words, is there a path beyond interpretation? We start today by discussing Susan Sontag's plea for, yes, less interpretation. I know, after all we've gone through, what does she mean by this? And we then look at related terms such as paranoid and surface reading. Here's a picture of Susan Sontag, the prolific writer, filmmaker, teacher, and political activist. She wrote several books on the experience of art in her life. One very famous one is called Notes on Camp. And camp is this aesthetic mode that is all about artifice and exaggeration. Another famous book of hers is called On Photography. And there she looks at the relationship between the modern obsession with photography and politics. And she writes that photos foster an attitude of anti-interventionism. Right? The individual who seeks to record cannot intervene in something. The person who intervenes cannot faithfully record it. The two aims contradict each other. So Sontag problematizes the culture of photography as kind of a chronic voyeurism. Now, Sontag didn't just theorize about these things. She actually acted as a journalist during the Vietnam War and also the siege of Sarajevo in Eastern Europe. Now, her ideas that we'll be dealing with today are essentially about mimesis, mimetic theory. We've come across this a few times already, actually. The idea that art imitates the real world. Sontag is interested in the historical perspectives on art that have yielded a certain way of doing criticism. Much like Heidegger, really. And like him, she's also not a big fan of how we do criticism. One of the first theories on art, this is Plato's theory, was a mimetic one. Plato's got a very famous metaphor in his book The Republic, where he talks about three beds. One bed exists as an idea, or a form, or an essence. The Platonic ideal. Another one is made by the carpenter, and another one is made by the carpenter as an imitation of the form. And then the third one is made by the artist. It's an imitation of the carpenter's imitation. So artists are not once, but twice removed from the truth. Artists, to Plato, are copiers. They only touch on a small part of things as they really are. An artwork is always a partial view on things. This, by the way, is exactly what cubists were fighting. The point that when you see a bed, it appears differently depending on your point of view, whether you look at it straight on or from a side or in the mirror and so on. Plato would say it's craftsmen who know what a chair is because they build them. They see them from all directions, so to say. Painters or poets really know nothing of the carpenter's art. Even the best painters or poets, they are, well, at best they are making something that resembles the reality of the carpenter making a bed. So yeah, art is fakery, if you follow Plato. His successor, Aristotle, understood art as mimetic as well, but he gave it more of a positive spin. Aristotle's got more of a practical view on art. He talks about catharsis, the effect of genres like tragedy on the audience. There's a point in such a story where everything sort of culminates and comes together, and a protagonist dies, for instance. To Aristotle, that sort of stuff triggers a purification of emotions, these universal emotions like pity and fear. As in, we can see a recognition of our own finite nature. We are all going to die, and we're working through this knowledge by looking at this art form. So yeah, it's less negative, but again, art is only good for something else, right? It's therapy. It has an ulterior motive. It is needed for this psychological cleansing. And as far as Sontag is concerned, from this moment on, this Greek theory on art as mimesis, as representation of reality, has always reigned supreme. And it's because of this theory that art has always been in need of some kind of justification to be defended. Art basically becomes a problem. Now, in order to come to a solution to this problem, something peculiar happens. People begin to separate a category called form from another one called content. Right? Our main opposition that we've been chasing since the New Critics, perhaps the main opposition of this course. And Derrida's point about binary oppositions goes here as well. One half is privileged over the other. When I asked you a couple weeks ago to summarize the movie Titanic, you probably thought about its content, right? About its story, about Jack and Rose and the sinking ship and so on. Content is the essential thing, right? The form, the kind of movie it is, and the way in which it tells its story through editing or music or whatever is really secondary. It's all about the what instead of the how. Note, by the way, that Sontag repeats an insight here that we've seen already, right? In the New Critics, in Russian formalism, and so on. All these theories were about form, because it was form that was considered important and not content. So Sontag is also drawing from these sources here. We typically say that art is saying something. Even when we think of it as an expression of the artist's mind, then it's saying, well, that. So this idea of content works for non-figurative art as well. We ask ourselves, what did Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko mean with their paintings? That's really, if you think about it, how we ask access to these paintings, by asking about what it is the painting says. So again, art is always in need of defense. And all that critics can do is debate the means by which that defense is given. And as you might have guessed, it's precisely this idea of content that Sontag says has become a hindrance. It's also very comparable to the points made by Derrida and Barthes. So Sontag is really introducing these new concerns with form instead of content to an American audience. Sontag then talks about the Western history of these implicit ideas about interpretation. And she basically tracks it down to late classical antiquity, around 4 centuries before Christ. Something happens with the power and credibility of myths that were experienced as such until then. These beliefs about the Greek gods and so on. What happens during this time in the West, Sontag says, is that natural philosophers start emerging, who start introducing things like the calendar and astronomy, and medicine, and so on. Basically, the first scientists. And Sontag says they created really the first idea of realism. Why? Well, because this is really the moment that we in the West started needing interpretation. We started needing to reconcile these popular ancient texts with their religious symbolism to these new demands of explanation. Interpretation was born as a problem. So for instance, we have the Stoics, the Greek philosophers, and they start posing that the gods were moral creatures, because that's what they were interested in, morality. And in order to say that, they had to use allegory to justify all these quite unlikable features of gods like Zeus and his pals. because in the books, they weren't quite the most moral folks. So these philosophers have to say what Homer really meant with Zeus's adultery with Leto was not actually adultery, but the union between power and wisdom, something like that. So you see that interpretation on a fundamental level presupposes a discrepancy, a gap, between the clear meaning of the text and the demands of the reader. And then it seeks to resolve that discrepancy. So the interpreter has to make the text acceptable again by, in essence, changing it. But, and this is the thing, they don't admit this, right? They will state they're only making the text intelligible by disclosing its true meaning. Now, to Sontag, in our modern age, this has become much, much worse. We basically went from this sense of reverence, with perhaps a hint of aggression to the original work of art, to outright aggressiveness and a contempt towards appearances. And the ultimate examples that she talks about of these worst practices are names of essentially structuralists, Marx and Freud. Freud's always banging on about manifest versus latent content, right? Dreams and slips of the tongue and the id and the ego and the unconscious and all that. And for Marx, anything we'd like to call culture actually refers to economic conditions and relations, right? His base and superstructure model. So both of these theorists are doing interpretation, right? They're restating the phenomenon. They're trying to find an equivalent for it. They're saying X is really Y. Sontag says at least the old style of interpretation, the Greek kind, was a bit more respectful. It really erected another meaning on top of the literal one. This new way of interpreting things, however, these forms of structuralism she's talking about, they're destroying something. They're always digging behind the text to find a subtext, basically, which is the true one. And so this is her way of putting that in a very polemic way, like the fumes of the automobile and of heavy industry which befoul the urban atmosphere. The effusion of interpretations of art today poisons our sensibilities. In a culture whose already classical dilemma is the hypertrophy of the intellect at the expense of energy and sensual capability, interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. Sontag is talking about how our sensibilities are being poisoned, right? She's saying that we are these intellectualist monsters who are always trying to see what's behind something instead of appreciating art for what it is. I think you can also see some parallels here with the phenomenologists when it comes to art, right? This idea that there is something that happens before we come in with all our intellectual efforts, and something that we cannot really see anymore because we're too preoccupied with this intellectual self-pleasuring. So what is needed here? Well, first, as you might suspect, because it's the thread running throughout this course, it's more attention to form. So again, we have arrived at a sort of formalist critique. Not just or even primarily looking at what is happening, but at how it is happening. And then, with this attention to form, Sontag says, we should try to give a proper description of what it is that we're seeing. It allows us to be much more precise about what is going on instead of sort of leaning on the ideas that the way in which something is represented is natural, and that all you can really do is talk about content. There's a link here too with post-structuralists who are saying that any linguistic act we engage in necessarily leaves things out of the picture. And this in turn leads to questions for us, like what is it that constitutes our data? And how does it come that this data comes to seem natural, as something you can't really contend with? If you do a Google search for the word data, you constantly find these kinds of pictures. Some businessman's hand holding data up as if it were the holy grail itself. The form of data is made fully transparent here. Roland Barthes would say its history is erased, right? All that matters is the content that it is representing. So really Sontag is thinking about a kind of criticism where you reveal the surface of art, and attention to this precise unicity, that thing that makes this artwork what it is. There's also some echoes here again of the new critics, right, who focus on the unicity of the object that you're looking at. Sontag is basically saying that once upon a time, it must have been revolutionary and creative to start to interpret works of art. But nowadays, it is not. And what we decidedly do not need right now is to further assimilate art into thought. The aim really of all commentary on art should now be to make works of art, and of course by analogy our own experience, more real to us. Not to detract from it with all this interpretation, but to show how it is what it is, or even that it is what it is, rather than to show what it really means. And I think for our purposes of doing digital hermeneutics, this fits in with the theme that we've been discussing, right? The idea that it's an attempt to focus on forms, to focus not so much on what something means, but how it comes to mean something for someone. It's about laying bare the process of interpretation, not just about doing an interpretation yourself and leaving it at that. Now, I think this quote really says it all. Sontag says, "Ours is a culture based on excess, on overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our sensory experience. All the conditions of modern life, its material plenitude, its sheer crowdedness, conjoin to dull our sensory faculties. And it is in the light of the condition of our senses, our capacities, rather than those of another age, that the task of the critic must be assessed. What is important now is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more." And there's something there to reflect upon for us today, and also outside of the realm of art per se. Really, there's more at stake here than just some minor scholarly discussion in the practice of hermeneutics. We should really, once in a while, and especially as humanities and social science scholars, try to look at things without resorting to ready-made interpretive frameworks. Now, this is something we touched upon already, right? The question is, doesn't that lack of commitment to a breaking down of the status quo lead to basically apolitical readings? I think it's important to realize that critical models see criticism essentially as a practice of freedom. That is, they're looking for a sense of autonomy and detachment and some liberating potential, either in the artwork itself or in the valiant labor of the critic. We do not need to criticize artworks because they contain their own critical and self-critical agency. So we need to be immersed in texts to free us from things like the apathy and instrumentality of capitalism by allowing us to bathe in the artwork's disinterested purposelessness, right? These Kantian terms we talked about. We also saw a second approach which really makes the critic a hero who performs interpretive feats of demystification. The example here would be something like deconstruction, or a structuralist reading of power relations underneath a seemingly innocent text. Again, our history of hermeneutics has been a history of the critic. We've seen this, right? They become really quite heroic figures. And you can see here the modern link between criticism and activism that we've touched upon in the last few weeks as well. Let's go back to a Marxist critic such as Frederick Jameson. He argues that interpretation should always seek a latent meaning behind a manifest one. So it takes a strong critic, someone who's not ideologically complicit, to disclose the status of the text as an ideology or a myth, as some imaginary resolution of real contradictions. We saw this in Roland Barthes' mythologies too, if you'll remember. He talks about this absent cause in texts that you're looking for, and that absent cause is history itself. So interpretation becomes all about unmasking, where the critic restores the history that the text represses at the surface. So Best and Marcus, in the text you'll read this week, use the term symptomatic reading. And as Sontag did, we can trace that back all the way across Western history. Best and Marcus talk about Gnosticism, these early Jewish and Christian movements, century or two before Christ, that believed in an unknowable God, and that basically all matter is evil, and that the non-material spirit realm is something good. Of course, there's Plato's parable of the cave as well, again, or the Christian focus on the non-physical afterlife, and so on. Again, it's about the content and not the form. Best and Marcus use the term surface reading to spell out an alternative. So it's similar to what Sontag means when she says she's against interpretation. It's a focus on absences and gaps and ellipses. This insistence on asking, what do these absences mean? What forces create them? And how do they signify these questions that motivate the text, but that the text itself cannot articulate? So it views the text itself, in a way, as being unable to properly express itself. And really, a lot of it boils down to the kind of way in which you want to think about this difference between what's there in a text and what's not there. Another text that you're going to read this week is by Eve Sedgwick. And she offers quite an original view on this matter of surface and depth. Have you ever wondered what's up with all this critical theory that's meant to uncover hidden power structures in an age when most of the violence is just plainly visible? It's not hidden at all, right? If anything, we seem desensitized to it. Sedgwick talks about the hermeneutics of suspicion, and like Sontag, she refers to thinkers like Marx and Freud, but also Nietzsche, who were looking for meaning beyond the text itself. And to apply a hermeneutics of suspicion is currently widely understood as the mandatory mode. If you're doing critical theory, this is what you do, right? You uncover power structures, you look at the gender differences, and so on. And Sedgwick says maybe there's a different way of looking at this, and that is as a choice about what kind of emotional position you take as a critic. Sedgwick calls the structuralist activity a form of paranoid reading. Paranoid because it is about an alertness to danger, a danger projected on everything that one encounters. It's always anticipating something. It's trying to prevent bad surprises by theorizing about the things around us, especially about the negative effects of the things around us, things like power imbalances or stifled voices, hidden structures basically that are affecting people instead of what they think, which is that they are in control as individuals. So paranoid reading places faith in exposure to get to know these negative effects. And like I said, we don't really need deconstruction or other demystifying strategies anymore to unmask all these forms of ideology. We have the pictures that we all saw that leaked out of Abu Ghraib. We have the real-time coverage of Hurricane Katrina. We have all the images of abandoned African-American citizens. We know of the many, many examples of police violence, and we can see politicians demonstrably telling lies about it because some people will swallow them. All these things are just out there, in your face. And what's more, compared to the 70s and 80s, when most of these critical theories were still in vogue, we have, I think, much more modest ideas about the power of things like literary criticism and theory, right? We don't really believe that we can right all these wrongs through academic, ideological critique. This also has to do with the crisis of expertise that we discussed last week. It is basically saying, well, there's things that lie in plain sight when we look at a text, and they are worthy of our attention, but they often elude direct observation. And that's especially by these deeply suspicious detectives who look past the surface in order to root out what's underneath it. I think we've seen that criticism often assumes that you need an adversarial relation to the object of criticism if you want to free yourself from the text's essentially deceptive or ideological surface. Anyone who spends time on YouTube will know that the kind of media criticism that you tend to find there is very comparable in the fundamentally antagonistic relation it sets up towards some form of media. What we call outrage culture these days might just be a lucrative equivalent of the kinds of art criticism that this week's counter critics are arguing against here. And this is where I hope it all comes together. Distant reading can be one way of doing criticism that is less antagonistic and more curious. Because despite its limitations, some of which we've discussed in the past weeks, this heuristics of text manipulation and transformation and selection is a way to consider text from a more replicable and, I suppose, unheroic perspective. And also, as I noted earlier, there is still lots to uncover in terms of the data that surrounds us and that influences our behavior and so on. In a sense, doing the kind of critical data research we've been doing for the past weeks is the latest step in this history of criticism that tries to see what's really going on. But it doesn't do so through some heroic effort to look at what a text represents or what it really means. Data analysis can very well be a form of surface reading, I think. What we do need to keep in mind that many of the methods that we use in distant reading are about the content again and not the form. So we do need to ask ourselves if we use bag of words models, for instance, where the content is preserved at the expense of the original form in which it was put, what are we losing? And how can we recuperate the kind of understanding of that form? For instance, through close readings. In this week's classes, what I'd like to discuss with you is how you think that the digital humanities could be a form of surface reading. Or, alternatively, that this whole idea of surface reading is something that goes against the political reality of the text. I look forward to seeing you then.